Hey, bonsoir. Bonsoir à tous. Je suis tellement contente de vous voir dans nos locaux ici au centre-ville de Montréal. Thank you for coming. My name is Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais reconnaître que nous sommes rassemblés sur le territoire ancestral et non cédé de la nation Ganéagaraga. And we recognize that in Tiohtià:ke, in Montreal, that this is a meeting place for many Indigenous nations from Turtle Island, and we're privileged to share this land with them. And as a think tank that does public policy work in the area of social policy, economic policy, and also in our study of the Federation through our Center of Excellence in the Canadian Federation, we recognize that public policy has also done great harm to Indigenous people, and so we keep that in mind as we do our work. Anyway, I thank you. It's always lovely to have people in our offices and to gather here. I know a lot of people in the room are familiar with the Institute, and I want to also point out that this coincides with our board meetings in December. So we have several of our board directors here, so thank you. And they come from across Canada, which is very lovely. If you're not familiar with the Institute, and this is the first time you've ever been in our offices in this lovely building, we have three main operations. We do in-depth research and convene events on topics of economic, social policy. We also have the Center of Excellence of the Canadian Federation, which I just mentioned, that studies Canada's federal community intergovernmental affairs. Nous publions aussi la revue Options politiques, qui publie des articles à peu près tous les jours sur les différentes dimensions de la politique publique au Canada. And you're encouraged to submit articles to that. The editor-in-chief, Les Perot, is over here. J'aimerais noter qu'on est un institut bilingue. On a toutes nos opérations dans les deux langues officielles. Mais pour ce soir, pour faciliter la conversation avec notre ami de Washington, on va avoir une conversation en anglais. Mais bien sûr, si vous avez des questions à poser à la fin, posez-les en français si vous voulez. On pourrait toujours les traduire. I want to also just point out a new colleague that's in the room, Inez Jaber-Perala, hello, who's the newly appointed CEO of Public Policy Forum. And I just want to say it's always beautiful to see a new peer in the room, and the think tank space is very small in Canada, so more collaboration is good. So thank you very much for coming tonight, Inez. It's much appreciated. So I want to introduce our speakers because we have a lot to talk about. You should see the list de questions que j'ai sur le thème de relations entre nos deux pays. Elle est longue. So Chris Sands is a director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, the largest policy research program on Canada outside of the country, and the leading source of scholarship on U.S.-Canadian relations in Washington, D.C. Chris previously directed applied policy research programs at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Hudson Institute, and has published extensively over a career of more than 30 years in Washington think tanks. And he's also a very valued member of the board of directors of the Institute. Here. Jennifer Welsh is the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill University. She was previously professor and chair in international relations at the European University Institute and professor in international relations at the University of Oxford, where she co-founded the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict. From 2013 to 2016, she served as the special advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the responsibility to protect. In 2025, she will become the director of McGill's Max Bell School of Public Policy, and congratulations on that. I have to say that the school is a great friend to the Institute, and outgoing chair Chris Reagan is here. Yeah, oh, right in front of me. That always happens when I want to point someone out, they're like right in front of me. And you'll know that some of our valued staff are from the Max Bell School, so we are happy to have moved them out of the school and into our offices, so thank you very much, and we're really excited about the continued collaboration, Jennifer. So just a few bits of factoids to set the conversation. Approximately $2 billion of trade, daily two-way trade between our two countries. The United States is Canada's #1 trading partner. I'm sure many of these things you already know. We were the largest purchaser of U.S. goods exports in 2022, accounting for 17.3% of total U.S. goods exports. We're the best customer to the U.S. when it comes to oil and petroleum. 60% of U.S. crude oil imports were sourced from Canada in 2022. An analysis by our friend Trevor Tombe, the economist, was that a 25% tariff would cause Canada to go into recession and lose 2.6% of its GDP. At the same time, the Peterson Institute for International Economics this past summer estimated that if Trump imposed tariffs of 20% on all goods, and they didn't even know that he was going to say 25%, it would cost the American family an additional $2,600 a year. So the flip side of that. So this is such a moving target that every time I would put some questions on the page, something new would happen. So the latest today was more pulling apart of the Mar-a-Lago special dinner that Trudeau attended on Friday, in which Trump apparently said that wouldn't you just want to become the 51st state of the United States, apparently, according to sources. The Ontario government put out an ad campaign in the last few days promoting our relationship between the two countries. And there's just been a daily mix of news about what's going on. Chris, I'm going to start with you. So Trump comes out with this tweet saying the first day I take office, 25% tariff on U.S., Canada and Mexico. Can you help us understand what his strategy is and what Canada's riposte should be to that?
Sure, and thank you very much for all coming and giving me a chance to ramble about my own silly country. It's always nice to be among friends, which is not always the case when I'm in Washington, so I like being here. We saw this in the first term with Donald Trump, what he likes to do, and when we're talking about Vladimir Putin, we talk about escalate to de-escalate. He has a tendency to get your attention with a big threat, but what he wants is also included in the message. So he said he would give us 25% tariffs, but what he wanted in exchange was border security, anti-human trafficking, anti-drug trafficking cooperation. And if you can get past the scariness of the threat, neither of those things is off the Canadian agenda. Canada's happy to work with us. Canada's better positioned to work with the United States than is Mexico on this, and that sets up a kind of rivalry between the two, which has gotten worse in the last little while. But I think he's achieved his end by getting our attention, just like he did when he said, I'm going to tear up NAFTA unless Canada and the U.S. agree to come to the table and make it better, which also worked. So he's got a shtick. It works for him, and I think just to say this about Prime Minister Trudeau, I don't think it was easy for the Prime Minister to go and see Donald Trump. He'd said a lot of bad things about Trump. A lot of people thought that he would, basically just get insulted or humiliated if he went to see Trump. But he did it anyway because it was the right thing to do for the country to start this dialogue, to be the more mature partner. He went and, they talked about the border. They talked about immigration. How could we work together? And they didn't talk about 25% tariff threats. So if I compare that to Claudia Sheinbaum, the new Mexican president, who came out with counter threats and we're going to really fight this, I think actually the Canadian strategy was pretty good. And we may be past this crisis, but guaranteed we'll have more. So lots to do. But that's where I think we are with that particular threat.
Jennifer, what was your thinking about just the whole negotiating strategy when you heard Trump come out with that on Truth Social?
It feels like every day is a week, right? It's everything. And I have to confess, I spent last week in Africa, so I have been catching up, and it's very interesting to just see how much happens in a day right now in response to what is coming out of the United States. I mean, I think there's two possibilities here for how to read this, and I tend to be on Chris's side, that we can either see the threat of the tariff as a negotiating strategy that is about getting movement on issues that Trump would like movement on. And I think I also agree with Chris that on those issues of the border, fentanyl, movement of people, we can find some common interests. It's actually a good thing for us to not necessarily be working separately from the United States with vis-a-vis the Chinese on fentanyl. We have a good story to tell about movement across the border. I think those who are doing the kind of analysis that you described at the beginning, the economists, are saying, well, what if there's another possibility here? What if there's a desire to fundamentally change the relationship that Canada and the US have? What if tariffs are actually a tool of industrial strategy? What if they are a tool to reduce trade deficits? What if that is how Mr. Trump, I'm not going to call him President, well, I should call him President Trump, but I'm not going to start calling him President Trump again until inauguration.
Until it's official.
What if that is the game, right? And so I think for the moment, we can feel pretty good if it's the first if it's the first possibility, that this is just a first throwing down of the gauntlet, and we want to see how you respond. And I tend to be in agreement with Chris for now, but I think it's just so unpredictable. And that is what, would reasonably have a number of Canadian analysts and politicians wanting to make sure we don't rest on our laurels and assume it's just the first possibility.
Chris, I want you to respond to that. Could this be them trying to reorient the entire way that the U.S. economy works and detach from a partner that's so entwined with?
I don't sense that. To give you an example, if you take a look at Robert Lighthizer book. Now, I know he doesn't have a role in the administration, still very influential. He wrote this book after he left government. It's called No Trade is Free. And it is a very scathing critique of some of the free trade agreements that we've negotiated. But 3/4 of the book's about China. And I think that there's a reason that Canada, Mexico, and China all came out at the same time. That those were the threats that were coming together. That China is the real decoupling challenge that they would like to make. Now, Canada's been very in line with the U.S. on China, not initially, but it's come to a greater extent in line. And when the U.S. put a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, Canada followed. There was a little bit of a delay, but it did follow. This is Mexico, which is the outlier here on that. I think Mexico's in much more trouble. And a lot of companies, including our auto companies, rely on a North American set of supply chains. And I think they're worried about the Mexico piece. But I think the Canada piece, there's not a desire to get rid of Canada, decouple from Canada, but rather to focus on how China is investing in North America and to try to decouple from that and not become dependent on it. Canada does bring potentially an alternative source of critical minerals. Canada's critical mineral strategy, I think, rightly emphasizes processing, the midstream in the critical minerals chain. And that's really important because most critical minerals processing is highly toxic. It has to be environmentally well regulated. And it's going to cost billions of dollars that are going to come out of the private sector, not out of the public sector. So it needs to be an environment where people feel like they're comfortable investing. And I think if I were to be critical of Donald Trump on this, I think one of the things that he is able to do is change the conversation with all of his threats and so on. But what the business community is looking for is a little more predictability, some stability of regime. Are we moving towards electric vehicles? Are we not? Are we going to be moving in this direction on taxes or that? And business will adapt to anything, but this constant changing of paradigm, the Biden goes this way, we go that way, I think is really bad for business. And at the end of the day, if he wants to be a winning president, he needs the economy to do well. He was able to have relatively good economics in his first term. So I think that's the natural limit. He doesn't want to break the economy. And it's not because he loves Canada, but because it works really well for us.
On the critical minerals piece and Canada's relationship to China, I find this very interesting because we don't have the capacity that the United States has in any way. And closing our borders is much more complicated, or friendshoring or whatever word that you want to use. What is the capacity for us to, other than EVs, for us to say, well, we're just not going to, trade with China anymore like that? Wouldn't that be an impossibility, Jennifer, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have many fewer cards to play on that score. And again, I think those in the Trump administration and the president-elect himself knows that, right? And so I think, we are in a much different place just in terms of the size of our market. I think the other piece that's interesting here is the piece about oil and gas, right? And when you look at the trade deficit that we have, and you take that piece out, you take that piece out, the trade deficit is not that large, right? So I think it is interesting that we have that dimension too, because right now the United States cannot meet its own demand. And that, I think we will see more of that energy discussion. We know that Daniel Smith has a relationship with the particular, it's Doug Burgum, is that how we pronounce his name? Who will be Minister of Interior, but is also supposed to head up this council on making the United States energy secure. So I would imagine if we get into the second scenario I painted, where tariffs aren't just a negotiating strategy, but actually this is part of a bigger picture attempt to change the relationship, that there'll be more discussion about energy. But it's just, there's lots of people in the room that know about this too. So that's what I would expect to see.
And we have things that they need and they want. So
absolutely.
So that's where our cards
things that
are.
the world needs, right? A lot of things that the world needs.
I'm going to pause. There are some seats right here. You good? Okay. So we're making a lot of like card playing analogies here, which is natural because it seems like we're in the middle of a game, right? A negotiation of a high stakes poker game. Does it matter who's at the table? So a Trudeau government, a Poilievre government, in terms of what player is dealing with this administration?
Well,
do you want to start?
At a cosmic level, no. I don't think that
That
President,
sounds so cool at a cosmic level.
At a cosmic level, yeah. I mean, I don't think Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump have a natural affinity. They're a different generation. They have different approaches to politics, et cetera. But at the same time, I think that because people here, and you can tell me, are relatively tired of Justin Trudeau. They're thinking, well, if we could just get rid of this guy, we'd be set. And I sometimes worry that the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, think, well, if we get elected, it'll be on the merits because everybody loves our program. But maybe they're just electing Conservatives to get rid of Trudeau, in which case, you can overread a mandate. Now, either of those situations is the same with Trump, which is Canada's weak, I'm strong, I want these things, we're going to try to negotiate. And I don't think the personalities at the end of the day matter nearly as much as the kind of fundamentals below the surface. And Trump is very difficult to deal with, but when you get past him, the professionals, the rest of the structure of the U.S. government is much more, regular, familiar, normal. And one thing that I think about the election we haven't taken into enough account in most of our discussions is the role of Congress. And Congress has ended up very tightly divided between the House and the Senate, between Republicans. Yes, they have a majority, but not a very big one. So it's going to be very hard to run both of those chambers. And we have rookies now, John Thune, I guess, in the Senate, and we have Mike Johnson back, although he barely survived last time, but he's going to be back. And so you'll see these two figures trying to figure out how to be even half as good as Nancy Pelosi was as Speaker of the House or Mitch McConnell was when he was.
Experience,
Experience takes time.
It's a really interesting observation.
And when you are that divided, the only things you're going to get through are the things that are close to the center. Both parties have a problem with their fringe. And so the middle things like national security, which rally a lot of Americans together, boosting the economy, those are the kind of things that will be very popular. And I think will be the best institutional check on Donald Trump's temper and the way that he wants to run things. And just as a final note on Congress, because I do have a lot of respect for them, but one of the big achievements of the first Trump term, in his mind, was the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which has a number of tax changes that expire this year. And so one of the things I expect that Congress will spend a lot of time doing is talking about the tax bill. And that will come up right away because they do expire in 2025. So I'm expecting that to be, it's a very navel-gazing American tax debate that doesn't really have to do with the tariff. And even if we did put 25% tariffs on, we're not going to make enough money to change the tax code. So those are the kind of things I think we should keep in mind. It's not the personalities, it's the structures, and the structures themselves are sort of built in an agenda that will probably overshadow the Canada-US relationship too often.
I think I would look at it slightly differently on the question of personalities and pay more attention to what the personalities mean for Canada's approach right now. So if you compare it with 2017, or even if you compare it to the last time we had an existential crisis after 9/11 with threats to close the border, right now you have challenges in having a cohesive Canadian position, right? So you have arguably four very important premiers who are going to outlast, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here and saying this, going to outlast Justin Trudeau, right? Francois Legault, Doug Ford, Daniel Smith, David Eby. They have all come out with interesting comments over the last week. Eby being a bit of an outlier, saying, British Columbia has always been quite diversified in its approach to trading partners. We see this as the way forward. And so I think what the personalities matter for our capacity to have a united approach. And that's where I think we need to look. And also, at the end of the day, as a deal maker, it's not so much about whether Donald Trump likes Trudeau, finds him annoying or not. He can smell that he is politically weak. He is politically weak, and that matters right now in this. Maybe you disagree, but I think it will matter that the Prime Minister of Canada is politically weak, and that you have premiers that know that, and you also have the prospect of an opposition leader who is very vocal about the very issues that we're trying to take a cooperative approach on the border. So Mr. Poilievre has said, well, if we're going to talk about the border, let's also talk about Canada's asylum policy. Let's not limit it to the safe third country agreement with the US, but let's look at whether we've got too many people coming into this country, right? And that's pretty significant that he's already shifted to that in the last few days.
But that's a fine line to tread, right? And
Absolutely.
I said this to Chris earlier today, but that when the 51st state thing came out, I thought Trudeau must have been so happy. And I'm assuming that they leaked that, or someone did, because that would go over very poorly with Canadians, right? So a question along those lines, Jennifer, is at what point does I always hated these public questions, but is there a problem with the Canadian public in the idea that maybe we're selling out Canadian values? Because I haven't heard any Canadian value discussion in the last few weeks. Like, what are our values over refugees? What are our values around climate? What are our values around labor? None of those things. It's all about what can we do, right, to avoid this 25% tariff. But I'm assuming at one point there will be a question about, where we are as a people vis-a-vis the United States.
Yeah, I think I share your concern about that. And in that way, I think perhaps Poilievre making the comment about asylum seekers in the last few days may actually give the government some room to bring those issues back to the table. Because if you think about, again, the 9/11 analogy, there Canada was very proactive in creating the Smart Border Agreement. The approach was, and I think, there has been lots of discussion about how should we act vis-a-vis the Americans. What's the right mix of carrots versus sticks, right? You might say we don't have very many sticks, but anyway, this is the language of diplomacy, right? But really what Smart Border was let's find a common interest and let's drill down and let's work together and let's be proactive in the solution to that common interest, right? And I think the discussion that started, led by Minister LeBlanc on, well, let's fix those issues around the border. We both have an interest in those. That's a productive way forward. It doesn't mean you necessarily give up on key values. But right away, very quickly, when you begin to talk about refugees or asylum seekers, there you are treading into that territory. And I think it perhaps will give the government an opening to say, look, we can deal with the United States on these crucial questions without giving up who we are. But, on climate, I think that's going to be harder. Let's see, because there's such a division of opinion now across our country on climate action policy. But I agree with you. There's two things that have worried me, if I'm really honest. One is, you stated it very well, values, and the other, and I'm going to sound very naive when I say this, but just give me a chance, is that I really see so much anticipatory surrender, right? The man is not yet president. And we see so much we have to give away before we've even been asked. And I do find that hard to watch. I have to be honest. I find it very hard to watch. But this is a very difficult moment.
It's the new PTSD. It's President Trump's stress disorder.
Yeah, it's anticipatory surrender. And I have to say, anticipatory surrender, let's take it into the private realm, is when you're dealing with someone who will exert their power in a very overt way. And that's when you engage in anticipatory surrender. So I guess maybe I'm kind of sad we appear to believe we're in that moment, right?
So I'm thinking about, if you go on a plane ride with your very young child, you bring like an anticipatory bag full of toys and like coloring books and Cheerios and things, and then you just pull them out like every 15 minutes. Are there some Cheerios and treats that we should put on the table, Chris, to head off the tantrum?
Well, you may not be able to hold off the tantrum, right?
Tariff.
But I do think that area that you raised, the shared values, does come into play in a couple of different ways. One, on global migration, I think the UN estimate is that we have 120 million people who are stateless and displaced now. And that's because of the conflicts around the world, and they are coming to a handful of countries where they think there's the prosperity and the potential for welcome that they could start over, because they don't have any hope of going home. And Canada and the US are two of the countries that have traditionally taken a lot of those folks, but that is a lot of people. And I think there's one argument that says, hey, we don't want them coming and taking our jobs, or that sort of thing. But there's another argument, which is if governments let them in, recognizing that they're not like your sort of old school immigrants to Canada who come in with advanced degrees and are ready to get to work, but they're people who may have language challenges, who may need help finding their feet in this society or in our society in the US side. Now that's Canadian compassion, always has been. I think there's room for that in the United States as well. Because we can't handle all of the people that we bring in, and we have to be careful to make sure the people we bring in we can handle, and we have outreach for them, whether that's government programs or community groups. I think that's something we share, and if we can sort of anchor in on that and say by collaborating, for example, on identifying individuals, we've done a lot of work when it comes to unaccompanied minors, trying to figure out, is the adult who brought them over actually a relative or actually not? Are the human traffickers? There's a lot of science in that. I think Canada's a trusted partner on those kind of things. So we should look for those areas where we could work together and hope for the best. You mentioned the environment. I think climate change is going to be one of those areas where you'll see more of the states talking about it, and you'll see the U.S. taking a kind of all-inclusive approach, including oil and gas, which maybe Canada doesn't want to talk about, but there are parts of Canada that would like to talk about. And so rather than say, okay, let's be exclusionary of one part of the debate, we'll just sort of muddle through. I think we've forgotten muddle through is okay. And we've been so polarized that we want absolutely right solutions, but most of our history we've muddled through with kind of messy compromises with a little bit of this and that. And I think that's democratic politics, and we'll see that. My last comment on this, which I think is also a shared value, but one that expresses itself differently in the two countries. I think Donald Trump has succeeded by tapping into a vein of people who felt excluded in a lot of discussions. They're blue-collar workers, lower middle-class families, others, and he's championed them. You can argue whether he's a true champion or not, but he's found a way to bring them in. And I think that's not opposed to Canadian values either. There are those kind of people in Canada as well. And if our politics can be more inclusive of popular concerns and small communities, that's not a bad thing. Our young men need to be part of the debate. We need to think about everybody. And unfortunately, I think, I'll just say this about me because I'm in Washington, and so I'm one of the no-good establishment elites. I don't think we have had, as sort of experts, the kind of empathy we needed to have with our fellow citizens who were feeling globalization or free trade or whatever the agenda item was differently than we were inside the DC Beltway. And that lack of compassion is being punished by the voters giving us the person we hated the most, or we feared the most, and he's going to make us miserable. But that's okay. I'll be fine. Don't worry.
Just let's talk a little bit broader on the geopolitical international scale. Jennifer, what are you hearing or thinking in terms of, let's talk first about multilateral organizations and how Canada plays into a new order where, a Trump administration is less inclined to participate, or maybe they aren't. We will see soon.
Yeah, I think I'd start by saying, despite how visibly different Trump appears to be, there has been, over the last 15 years, a change in the nature of U.S. leadership in international institutions. Even though after his election, after President Biden's election, many people said, oh, great, the U.S. is back at multilateral tables. It didn't actually play out that way, with a few exceptions, right? So if you think about, I'll give you a couple of examples. It certainly didn't play out at the WTO, where we continue to have virtually a moribund global trading system that will not change under Donald Trump. It didn't play out in an organization, post-pandemic, the World Health Organization. The United States, after COVID, in most of its strategizing and work, was much more interested in alternative organizations. If we were thinking about reforming pandemic preparedness and response at a global level, it was saying things about the WHO, but it was much more interested in working through the G20, the G7, other kinds of global health mechanisms, not really that supportive of the move to create a pandemic treaty, not really that invested. And within the UN, I think it's a little bit more complex. So certainly for the United States, the UN Security Council was an important place to shame, and the General Assembly was an important place to shame Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. But it was very complex and continues to be complex for the United States over the war in Gaza, where it found itself completely isolated in terms of its approach to certain resolutions. So it's been shifting for a long time in terms of the commitment to the multilateral system. And President Biden also engaged in some creative development of new organizational forms, right? So AUKUS, as a new defense relationship for the Indo-Pacific, the Summit of Democracies. Let's get democracies together. So he was playing around outside of the traditional formats. And, my own view on that is that I think Canada recognized it, but didn't react in a particularly creative fashion itself. It's getting there. It's realizing that the world, the multilateral world is changing, and we need to engage in different places and in different ways. Now with President Trump, it will accelerate. His appointment as ambassador to the UN is a woman who has been openly critical of the UN, particularly critical of the UN's stance towards Israel, or perceived stance towards Israel. And, John Bolton was a particular kind of U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. I think his joke was, you could take out a few floors and, it wouldn't really matter. The Secretariat's bloated. But he did have much more experience engaging. I think this particular ambassador not only has very strong views, but doesn't have a lot of experience engaging multilaterally. So I am worried about what that is going to mean for U.S. diplomacy within the UN system. But, you know, there's some very big agenda items on that, on the multilateral scene. You know, the future of peace operations. That is going to be discussed in 2025. What is the future footprint for the UN in conflict countries? And I cannot see, unless things changing, the U.S. being completely or being very interested in investing in those kinds of discussions. Whereas I think a Democratic administration might have been a little bit more invested.
It's very interesting, and I'm going to reflect on that in a couple of ways. One is that Donald Trump Part 1 and Joe Biden, and I think Donald Trump Part 2, have something. They've realized something which has turned out to be very politically potent, which is that after a long period of relatively unsatisfactory wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the public was quite tired of those kinds of conflicts. And what Trump did the first time was shifted the U.S. strategic posture to deterrence. And for whatever reason, deterrence is quite popular in the U.S. We are willing to spend a lot of money on weapons in order to convince the big countries, the Chinas and the Russias, that they shouldn't take a poke at us, because if they do, it won't end well. And we'll spend a lot of money. I think we're trying to spend even more money than $880 billion or whatever we paid last year. They're talking about going over $1 trillion a year, which is going to be tough with our debt, but still, that's the ambition. And when I was talking about the election, during the election, one of the differences between a lot of American towns and Canadian towns is just the scale at which Americans were involved in that war. You can go to a lot of American communities where young people who are in Generation Z know somebody who lost somebody in one of those wars, or knows that there's one of the veterans who've come back who's got a prosthetic, and they see them in their community. So if that doesn't make you not keen on wars that don't produce democracy abroad and don't really lead to a successful conclusion, I don't know what does. And I think that's one of the reasons that some of those voters decided to vote for Trump. So what does deterrence mean for Canada? I think in the Cold War, the U.S. deterrence posture it limited what the U.S. was willing to put on the table as, this is our red line, don't cross it. And that opened up space for countries like Canada, and I don't want to invoke the old middle power myth, but to be in a position to work within institutions to try to build norms and consensus that wasn't at odds with the American view, in fact, often was in sync with it, but where the U.S. simply wasn't willing to invest in all of the institution building, coalition building that's necessary to make these institutions work. And that leads me to one last comment, which I know you'll remember. If you've read John Holmes' famous memoir, where he talks about life with Uncle, one of his observations is that if you lived through the period of the post-war, many Canadians saw, like, the Americans were greatest hits all the time. There's the UN, it was NATO, it was Bretton Woods institutions. Everything was brilliant, and it worked out so well. But he said if you lived through it, you saw it was just this continuous process of trial and error, trying to see if it would work, try this, try that. A lot of things that we no longer remember went nowhere. And I think that is important to remember when you talk about AUKUS and some of the other organizations. Do you remember I2U2? Not actually a Star Wars droid, but Israel, India, United States, United Arab Emirates, a very strange coalition, but it was something that we tried and are still to try. So I think allowing for that experimentation, seeing Canada as empowered in a role this way, but understanding that the U.S. investing in deterrence is going to limit how much it's going to engage at that micro level, I think tells you a lot about how we've been under the past two presidents. Now, last comment. Well, this is my second to last comment. We are stuck with leaders who, like me, are products of the Cold War. And I do think America will look different when it's in the hands of a younger generation. And Trump was older, obviously Biden was older, and now we have Trump again. I think there's going to be some shift that comes when we finally get younger leadership. And if I were to offer all of you something to do, just engage those younger Americans. They are available. They're at universities and others. These are the people that you'll want to build the future with. And right now they have time, including people in Congress.
Just a very quick, because you didn't ask explicitly about it, but people may be thinking about it, and that is the NATO alliance.
Yes.
Right. So I think here is where there will be, I could be wrong, it could be bluster, but I think there will be a change because President Biden, because of his Cold War life experience, was very committed to the NATO alliance. rallied action on Ukraine. I mean, without the Biden administration and the president in particular, I don't think the response on Ukraine would have been what it was. And so, you know, a lot of Ukrainians were watching on election night, for sure, and are extremely worried about, you know, what it means. And that's why we're seeing right now in these dying days of the Biden administration so much action to provide military assistance to Ukraine. I do think it will be interesting to see what happens with the NATO alliance formally versus informally. Because, you know, deterrence, an interesting concept. What do you need to do to deter? It's part physical buildup, but it's also about the credibility of what you do and say. It's partly we're dealing in the land of psychology, but we are with NATO as well. So the Trump administration doesn't have to formally withdraw from the alliance. It doesn't need to do anything particularly bold. It can just begin to question in a way that Donald Trump is a master of, right? Let's sow a little doubt. Let's create a little chaos. He can begin to say, I don't know whether if X country was attacked, we would defend them. And as soon as that becomes a question mark, I think that's really problematic.
Hugely destabilizing.
Very, very destabilizing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And for Canada, I do think we will be pushed, but the Biden administration was pushing just a little bit more subtly on us meeting our NATO spending commitments. And I think that will be, and it's a big ask, but it is something that we have to have an answer to. It will mean doubling our defense budget over, from 41 billion to 80 billion. That is a lot of money for Canadians right now, a lot of money. We should have no illusions about that. But it will be, I think, something we will be pushed on, for sure.
And I mean, as some of the work that we're doing at the Institute, there is a whole industrial policy side for Canada in terms of our defense spending and having dual purpose for some of these spends. We had a
Absolutely.
Conversation with the Premier of Yukon yesterday in Ottawa, and this is a benefit for them if we can increase spending in defense. But I'm going to go to questions, but I wanted to go back to the whole middle power question. And there was a chance, there was during this Trudeau administration, when they came to power, it was about Canada's back and the world needs more Canada. But instead, I'm going to give you my assessment, I guess, is that they got really consumed with the Trump relationship for a long time. And I see Robert Greenhill here and a few other people who know about this subject very well, but I didn't detect Canada coming back in the way that perhaps we expected that they might in Haiti and other places. But you tell me if you think I'm off base, and then I'll go to questions.
I certainly think from a policy development point of view, like really being creative about how can we position ourselves on particular policy issues globally and have some impact and form some new kinds of partnerships. I don't think we came to the table in nearly a sufficient way. And I think we were consumed. And I think now, it is very hard, but I think it's indefensible, right? I do. We are a G7 country. I think what those first years showed was it's very hard for Canada to walk and chew gum at the same time when we're talking about being able to engage multilaterally in a creative way and manage the Canada-US relationship. I would say that's our job, but we didn't really do it. And now we are in that position again with a minority government, with a president that's threatening terror. I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to do it this time either.
So that leads me to just make two comments. I promise only two because we want to hear questions. The first is, I think the U.S. is in a point where it really needs to think about how it conducts its relationship with Canada. And that's partly because we've become so well integrated, so tightly integrated, that domestic policy agencies play a bigger and bigger role. And we haven't quite come to terms with what that means in terms of supporting our domestic officials who are actually working on important things with their Canadian counterparts. I also think our Congress doesn't have a very good way of thinking about Canada. They sort of stick it in the Western Hemisphere subcommittees of House Foreign Affairs or Senate Foreign Relations. They don't get much oversight. Not even when we have COVID did you have congressional committees looking at the border closures and saying, what the heck happened? And there were constituents who were concerned about it. So in a lot of ways, I think we need to rethink the way we manage the relationship. That's the first point. But the second point I would make is that I think the United States could use a Canada that, as much as we want you to spend money on defense, we would love to have you spending money on diplomacy and development. And the shock of Tony Blinken coming up, and Bob Greenhill will know this as well, and asking, can you help with Haiti? And can you position yourself to be helpful in post-conflict Ukraine? And the answer was, no, it's too much. I think it's created this dialogue, it's discussion that you hear a lot in Washington about Canada, which is, are we dealing with a Canada that won't or a Canada that can't? If it's a Canada that won't, then we'll just keep bargaining, carrot, sticks, whatever, to get you to say, okay, you will, because that's normal. But if you can't, if 2% is just too much, if you can't organize a military or you can't fund your diplomacy properly, then we don't dislike Canadians. We'll just stop asking you to do stuff. And I think a lot of people see that in AUKUS. They see it in some of the other conversations where Canada wasn't brought in, not because anybody hates Canada. It's just like, well, what's Canada going to do? And if you've looked at Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, it's like, well, yes, we could do a northern quad with Korea and Japan and the U.S., and this would be great. And then you see the U.S. meeting with the Koreans and the Japanese, and some of the Canadian reporters are like, hey, are you going to have Canada join you? And they're like, what does Canada bring to this conversation other than another mouth? I mean, they didn't say that. Japanese would never be so rude, but that's kind of a problem.
Just a very last point. I know you want to take questions, but on the things that you don't think people are focusing on, when you said we'd be happy for you to do diplomacy and development, one thing to look at is how development policy will change under the Trump administration. Read some of what his, brain trust are saying about development policy. There's a clash of values on issues around gender equality. It will be very different. USAID under the Biden administration was pursuing a very ambitious approach to development. And I think that's going to change a lot. And what Canada would want to do on development is probably not what the Trump administration would want Canada to do on development. But that's just something to watch. People will be watching other things, but watch that as well.
Thank you for that. We haven't even talked about artificial intelligence and all of this crazy mix of things. But thank you everyone for coming. Merci à vous tous. On a une réception en arrière et vous êtes invités de prendre un verre avec nous puis continuer la conversation avec nos invités. And thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure to see you.